Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean text and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. We're going through and spending a significant amount of time in chapter 1 of the DeWitt book, because what DeWitt has said he's attempting to do, and what would be good in terms of presenting the philosophy to people who are not professional philosophers, who haven't read a lot of Epicurus, is to start at a very general level of the significant aspects of Epicurus, why it's important to understand the topics that he was addressing. And so we're going through a series of episodes here that is really more oriented towards newer people who haven't read a lot of Epicurus. But for purposes of setting the stage for people who are new to the study of Epicurus, this first chapter attempts to provide background that you can use to understand it as you read the details. What DeWitt is doing here is allowing us to understand what the forest is before we examine the particular trees. And so the last 2 weeks, we've examined some of DeWitt's general observations about how the philosophy breaks down and what sources remain available to us and how those sources need to be treated very carefully given how often they were written by people who are hostile to Epicurus. And today we're going to begin a section in DeWitt's chapter 1 that he is calling true opinions versus false opinions about Epicurus. And the first of those elements that DeWitt discusses is Epicurus's place in Greek philosophy. And DeWitt says that it's often thought that Epicurus taught in response to Stoicism. And that is, in fact, a false opinion, because the truth is that Epicurean philosophy was fully developed before Zeno had begun teaching Stoicism, and that Epicurus does not come after the Stoics in terms of time, but that he comes immediately after Plato and Pyrrho. And that what Epicurus was really reacting to in his writing was not to the writings of Stoicism in terms of reacting against the suppression of emotion or pleasure being bad. What he was writing against was basically Platonism and skepticism. In other words, the ideas that Plato had promoted, that there are ideal forms and that is the method of understanding absolute truth, or the Pyrrhonic idea, the skeptical idea, that no truth is possible to ever understand, and that therefore the best we can hope for is tranquility, and to get out of our mind the idea of controversies among competing arguments about what's true and false. And so that's the first topic to talk about. And I know that the very title that he gives to that, Epicurus' place in Greek philosophy, I know my general understanding of Epicurus before I started reading him more closely was that Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Epicurus, Zeno, the Stoics, that I presumed that Epicurus was simply a link in the chain, that he was mostly consistent with the others. And of course, taking the rather negative view of philosophy that I've always had, I figured he was just playing games with the words of those other philosophers and that they were all basically taking the same position. But I think that's a very superficial and incorrect assessment of Epicurus. In many ways, Epicurus was a strong rebel against the consensus that the other philosophers had reached on many issues, which is why Epicurus is held in such disrepute among philosophers of his time and philosophers in later years.
I think what might be interesting is to take a little bit of time to maybe talk about how the false opinions arose, because he says the false opinion is that Epicurus taught in response to Stoicism. Well, how does that opinion come about? That's the really interesting thing to me. And it comes about, in my view, largely because of not necessarily modern commentators, but this was something that was already deeply entrenched in antiquity, and particularly in the Roman world, where you have people like Cicero who are writing dialogues in which competing schools of philosophy are arguing against each other. And it's always anachronistic when you try to apply it backwards to Greek philosophy. But of course, it made sense in Cicero's time, because in the Roman world, this is precisely what you presumably did have. You did have Stoics arguing with Epicureans. You did have Epicureans responding to Stoics. So it does make sense in a historical context as to why these opinions come up. But it's always worth establishing first principles and to going back to the source, to the origin, and to figure out what Epicurus was really doing when he was alive. And as DeWitt is saying here, what he was really doing was responding to Plato. And so this is where I think maybe the second question of interest comes up. To what extent do we need to be reading Plato in order to understand Epicurus? I bring that up because I think I remember reading in Arthur Schopenhauer, he said something to the effect of, if you haven't read Kant, you're not going to understand much of what I have to say. So to what extent is that true about Epicurus and Plato? If you haven't read Plato, are you going to understand really what Epicurus is trying to say?
You've raised 2 points there, Joshua, and I want to comment quickly on the first one in terms of how this all came to be. It's very interesting to me how a lot of material that we know about this controversy derives from Cicero, especially his book On Ends. And of course, in that book, what Cicero does is he puts the Epicurean position in the mouth of a figure by the name of Torquatus. And then he gives the Stoic and the Platonic or academic position in the words of other of his friends. And he basically makes their discussion into a debate between the philosophers. But maybe the more important issue that you've raised is the issue of, can you really understand Epicurus if you haven't read Plato? And I think it's very, very valuable to read Plato. I know in my own view, it's been helpful to me to read back into especially Plato's work called Philebus, in which there's a long discussion of the nature of pleasure and whether pleasure can be the good and so forth. And when you read back into those Platonic arguments, you see the root of many of the issues that Epicurus addresses. And if you don't know where these issues come from and what has previously been said, I think you're really at a disadvantage in understanding Epicurus's position about those things. It's not possible for people to know everything as they start reading Epicurus, but I think it surely is important over time to understand that Epicurus wasn't writing in a vacuum. He wasn't living on an island in the ocean and just thinking about things that nobody had ever talked about before. It seems to me that he's pretty clearly responding to what he'd been taught when he was younger, what his teachers had exposed him to, and agreeing and disagreeing with certain things that they had written.
It's useful to understand the details, and especially if you want to get into debates, to know that. But otherwise, I would see no need for an Epicurean to waste time on reading Plato. I mean, it's enough to read a few secondary texts which mention this, and then you know enough about that already. Incidentally, before I got into Epicurus, I started to read into Plato, and luckily I didn't continue. Consequently, I went ahead and bought the book with Epicurus text, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. I would still be studying Plato for years before eventually going back to that hint I had that I want to read Epicurus too. So that means for me, it would have been a bad idea to read Plato first. And I still think from the glimpses I did now, it's actually a waste of time if you're already fully in Epicurus and you don't care about debating philosophy.
It's an interesting question. And of course, the broader context within philosophy of this sort of minor context of the Epicurean response to Plato is this broader claim that I can't remember who said it, but there's that famous quote that all of philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. And so that simply by having an idea of some of the things that Plato was thinking, you're going to have a better context. And maybe Martin is right. And you don't need to, spend a whole year or summer or whatever plowing through Plato's work in order to get that. But one interesting example that comes to mind is a book that was written by Karl Popper called The Open Society and Its Enemies. And he's dealing in response to certain 20th century socio-geopolitical issues that I don't need to give the names of. Everyone will immediately think of what I'm describing here. But he starts in the beginning of the book by tracing it all back to Plato and the things that he was writing about in his Utopia and his version of an ideal society. So there is a necessary sort of framework that, I think that it would be useful to have hold of, but you don't need to have necessarily a totally thorough reading of everything that was going on in the 3rd or 4th century in Greece in order to have an understanding of what Epicurus was saying, because he explains it for you. The only other thing I was going to say is that the thematic arrangement that Cicero employs here in putting Stoic against Epicurean and Epicurean against skeptic or academic or that kind of thing maybe comes down to us from this interesting way of putting books together in the ancient world. Like, for example, Plutarch wrote a book called Parallel Lives, or Lives of the Greeks and Romans, in which he would take a notable Greek like Alexander the Great and compare him with a Roman who had done or attempted to do similar things like Julius Caesar. And the word I used before was anachronistic. So it's always anachronistic to do this, but you can learn from it. So that's the other thing. But Martin, you had a response.
Yeah, regarding this book from Popper, I really like it, but the issue is it's how to say this, and I forgot the name for this one. When you have a text, you don't write as something objective, but really to almost ridiculize the enemy. How is that called? In philosophy, this is very popular. There are many examples of this. And
something like satire or...
Yeah, okay, but let me then come back what I actually want to say, then independent of that work. So, and when I read it, it sounds very convincing. Actually, most of what I think I know about Plato is from that book. But I see also that professional philosophers nowadays, with Platonic reasoning, they really say that Popper doesn't know enough about Plato and was very sloppy in his analysis of Plato's philosophy. That means if you really want them to refer to this, you would have no other choice than to study Plato himself or others, because you cannot rely on what Popper wrote there is really adequately representing Plato.
Yeah. These are just difficult issues that we're talking about. And so, it's funny because we actually have people on the forum right now who are going through the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. So sort of getting into these old texts and trying to wrangle with some of the claims that are being made, there is probably some value there. But I wouldn't say that it's absolutely required in order to understand the main thrust of what Epicurus was saying. Incidentally, there is another book along these same lines, and it was a book by Boccaccio in the Renaissance called De Claris Mulieribus, or On Famous Women. And in that book, he gives a biography of Leontian, in which he skewers her endlessly for being everything that, in his view, a woman should not be, and has become sort of an interesting source for what we know about how people reacted to Leontian. That's just by the by.
I'm going to discipline myself and not constantly say that this is why I like DeWitt's book so much, because he brings up issues like this. And it's funny almost to listen to the different opinions about how much of the background you really need to know. But that's what DeWitt is doing here in this opening section. And what we're trying to do in this podcast is to provide the general information so that you have some information about what's going on in the background, but you just don't have time to go through yourself into all of these details, or else you would never emerge from the different rabbit trails that you could follow by going into every detail like that. You have to come back up for air to the surface and just simply get a grip on where you are, get your bearings before you go further into all the different details that could be argued. So again, as we go through this list, in fact, that's what we're doing, is to try to provide those landmarks that people can think about as they go forward without having gone through all of the details themselves, which is just absolutely impossible to do. So in summary on this section, what is important to know is, from a general overview level, that Epicurus is not a writer who is focused on pleasure and arguing against Stoics as the main purpose of his life. The world has mutated those terms, Epicureanism and Stoicism, into food, drink, and the pursuit of hedonism and pleasure. And Stoicism, in contrast, is the absence of emotion. What DeWitt is attempting to make us realize is that modern attitudes can be superficial. And before we dive into the details, and as a reason to dive into the details, what we need to understand is that Epicurus was much deeper than simply arguing about suppression of emotion with the Stoics. Epicurus was largely reacting to what Plato and the skeptics had suggested were the foundations of philosophy. And just for purposes, again, at this preliminary stage, those issues were largely, in Plato, an idealism, that there is an absolute right and wrong that we derive from eternal forms that exist somewhere in the universe, that there are not really rabbits out there for us to chase, but there is in some place in the universe an ideal rabbit that exists, that all rabbits share a part of. And so Plato had an elaborate idea of what truth was all about that Epicurus was rejecting. At the same time, there were people like Pyrrho who had rejected the idea of any kind of absolute truth at all and said that you could know nothing. And so in summary of the section, what DeWitt is stressing is that the absolutism of Plato and the skepticism of Pyrrho were both targets of Epicurus, as DeWitt says here, among Epicurus's chief abominations. I'm not sure I should rank one as being worse than the other. But it's all in that issue of knowledge and whether knowledge is possible that really Epicurus probably shines and is more important than in any other aspect of his philosophy, because it's that approach that led him to develop his positions on pleasure and virtue and things like that. Okay, so that's point number one of a long list for us to talk about. The second point that DeWitt raises is the understanding that a lot of people have about Epicurus's attitude towards learning. The true opinion, according to DeWitt, is that Epicurus was in fact himself well educated and he was a trained thinker. And as we've been discussing earlier today, much of what Epicurean philosophy is about is a very scholarly reaction to previous positions that other people had taken. And he was being very logical and reasonable and methodical in his approaches. But somehow the reverse has come to be the consensus of many people. They consider that Epicurus was, DeWitt's word is ignoramus, and that he was an enemy of all culture and basically an enemy of all learning, and that he rejected all forms of logic and all forms of reasoning. And he was just basically a regression in the history of Greek philosophy as opposed to a progression. So let's talk about that. Whether Epicurus was a friend of culture and art. Supposedly Epicurus said the wise man is not going to compose poetry himself. But on the other hand, the wise man is the only one who can really understand poetry. And there are quotations to the effect that Epicurus said something about set sail and flee all culture. And Epicurus' attitude towards learning. There are people who will point to, I think it's in the letter to Epicurus, that we don't really need to know the truth of something. All we really need to know is a theory that will make us happy. And so, therefore, if you look at it from that perspective, they're saying Epicurus is not really a scientist. He's not really interested in the truth or knowledge at all. He's just trying to have a good time. So what do you think of Epicurus' attitude towards learning and what attitude we should, in fact, take towards learning?
Yeah, the attitude is based on what was taught at that time often. From an Epicurean perspective, it's no point to waste time to study what's wrong, also to study false things or what's irrelevant. So in that sense, then of course, because that one was apparently what was most in the curriculum, what was to be studied, then of course it makes sense and better do not do that. Education, it's similarly like to some people who don't like what's in the curricula or how they're taught at schools, who then rather do homeschooling.
Yeah. Joshua?
I think that quite a lot of what Epicurus is responding to has something to do with the vagaries of the way that children and adolescents were educated in ancient Greece. And it all has to do with this gymnasium system. And he seems to have had a lot of problems with it. And I think that it's because of that all this extra stuff gets imputed to him, and because of certain things that he did say, although maybe meant in a different way than people interpreted. Cassius, you raised the question of poetry. So it's not just, I don't need to know anything. What good has education ever done for anybody? Culture is meaningless. I don't think Epicurus is taking these positions, but I can see why this interpretation has come up. Once again, I'm always more interested in how the false interpretation arises. And again, I think it has quite a lot to do with this bizarre system that was in place at the time that was starkly different from anything that would be classed under what we would call school or education in the modern age. And the other part of that is that Epicurus was not welcome in these circles anyway. So it's not as if, if he would have approved of them or something, they would have let him in. No, his ideas were too dangerous to them, were too maybe even absurd in their view, too preposterous, too corrupting of the youth. So they didn't want him around anyway. So it's no surprise to find that he didn't have much time for them. They had no time for him. You saw in two cases, both of Anaxagoras and Socrates before Epicurus, charged with corrupting the youth because of their public teaching rather than simply doing what Epicurus was doing, which was teaching in a private setting.
Yeah, Joshua, I think you brought up last week, and I also think it's being discussed on the forum right now as our friend Don is going through the Nicomachean Ethics, that the goal of education in ancient Greece was focused on the political, to produce a good citizen, to produce a state, the Greek city-state, that would function the most successfully according to their view. So the whole orientation of education and culture and so forth was the bringing of the individual into conformity with these predetermined ideas of what the correct state should be and how the correct state should function. And if everything you're talking about, the gymnasium, if everything in the educational system is set out with that as the goal, and if Epicurus in fact rejects that goal, then it's going to be natural and to be expected that Epicurus is going to say, get out of that system and look at what they're teaching you and go in a different direction. He's not going to say, don't worry about education. He's not going to say, don't worry about what direction he's going to go in. He's going to point out what he thinks is wrong about the existing system and tell you to examine it for yourself, understand what's right and what's wrong, and then chart your course for the correct goal, which is not just to raise worker bees or soldiers or philosopher kings like Plato and Aristotle and the rest of the conventional Greeks were aiming towards. He was rejecting the full foundation of their educational system, which is not the same as rejecting education or systemization. He's saying their view of it was wrong and his was correct. A good example of it is we haven't mentioned so far in this part of the discussion, the example of the geometrician, I think is what his goal was, who allegedly gave up his work in geometry after he became an Epicurean. And Francis Wright discusses how what the truth in all likelihood was that he didn't necessarily give up all of geometry, but he put it in perspective to realize that a happy life was the real goal and not geometry as a goal in itself. What's his name?
Polyaenus.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's one of the best examples I think that's out there. You'll hear people talk about him, and you'll hear people talk about Epicurus's disdain towards poetry and Epicurus's disdain towards this general word culture. And the people who are not friends of Epicurus will basically set up Epicurus as if he's an enemy of all education, an enemy of all knowledge, and just a thoroughgoing hedonist who's not interested in anything but the pleasure of the moment. And one other example that comes to mind is one book that many people have read, Martha Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire. If you get towards the latter parts of that, there's a discussion there where Ms. Nussbaum thinks that the Epicurean school, and we'll discuss this later on in terms of dogmatism, that in Epicurus's garden, you were basically intimidated into following the decisions and the conclusions of Epicurus himself, and you were not supposed to challenge anything or speak up or speak against the particular position that Epicurus was taking. And that would be, I think, another example of a very wrong attitude about Epicurus, because Epicurus is telling you that there's nothing more important in your life than to use your senses and use your reasoning to examine things and challenge things, to question authority. And so there are these attitudes out there, including in a book like Therapy of Desire, that need to be challenged. Okay, let's go to the third point that DeWitt has raised. And the issue is Epicurus's goal for himself and his work. And DeWitt says that it's true that Epicurus was not only a philosopher, but he was a moral reformer rebelling against his teachers. But that there's a superficial and false opinion out there that Epicurus was nothing more than a copycat, in that he was ungrateful to his teachers. And I want to turn that over also to Joshua and Martin. But before I do, one example that comes to mind there is the story that I think is probably the earliest of the experiences in the life of Epicurus, where he reacted against his teachers who at an early age were teaching him that everything originated from chaos. And I believe the story is that Epicurus questioned and asked where chaos came from or how it came from chaos. He questioned the idea that everything in the world arose from a preliminary state of chaos. And so to me, that's an example of Epicurus rebelling against his teachers, taking the position that what they're teaching him made no sense, and setting out to chart a new path, to find out what he thinks does make sense and reach what he thinks is a more rational, reasonable conclusion based on the evidence that's available. And to that extent, I'll comment that he's ungrateful to his teachers. Well, at some point, you do have to think about what the proper attitude is to a teacher who has taught you something that you think is completely wrong. You certainly are grateful perhaps for the time they spent with you, but if you think that they're absolutely wrong, how much time do you really spend in the rest of your life citing teachers and earlier thinkers who you've concluded are just wrong? As Martin was talking earlier, how much time do you really need to spend reading material that you think is incorrect?
One of the issues that we're confronting here is that we're hanging quite a lot on very few words of Diogenes Laertius, where he says that, for example, Epicurus denied his teachers and claimed to be self-taught. We don't actually have that in Epicurus' own words, and we don't have any further explanation as to what he might have meant by that. But the point about chaos is a very important one. He's being instructed by people who are claiming that the primordial existence in nature was chaos, but they can't even define chaos. They can't explain what it is. And he apparently found that completely repulsive and charted his own course. Some interesting points to bring in here is that apparently his father was a school teacher, and that was a very low-paying and sort of degrading line of work in ancient Greece. And his mother was apparently went around selling charms, and he went around selling charms with her. And so much of the record of what we're discussing here is in lost works that we only have the titles of, like Metrodorus wrote a work on low birth, presumably defending Epicurus. But the issue of Epicurus being a moral reformer is one that DeWitt makes very clearly in this book, and we're going to hear, I think, quite a lot more about that. But it's certainly the case that what he, the system, which I think he developed quite early on in his 20s or very early 30s, was sufficient to get him basically thrown out of town in one instance. And so it's not like he just accepted everything he was taught. He had a very devoted spirit of inquiry. He wanted to know how things worked, and he wasn't willing to just settle for bad answers like chaos. Answers that are not answers, that cannot be explained, that have no explanatory power, and from which you can't derive any inferences. So he developed his own system to his own personal risk, which was considerable, given the fate, as I said, of Anaxagoras and of Socrates. And it's not surprising, I think, that he would sort of feel the instinct to break the chain between himself and his teachers when he so greatly disagreed with them.
Martin?
I mentioned it in other discussions already. So the thing is that Epicurus' own philosophy was different from what you learned. Of course, he has elements from preceding philosophers and also including his teachers, but because then he made something different out of this, then that's why he might have said that he's self-taught, because in the end he came up of something what is different from what he started with. And according to modern standards, he would have had to refer to those elements which he included to those philosophers from where he took it. And so in that sense, then from a modern perspective, then it is in some way true that he got things from others, but from the way apparently was practiced from his line of thinking, because he changed it, modified it, and came up then with something what was ultimately different, he saw no need to refer to predecessors.
And to the point where in some cases he felt that the differences were so considerable and so important as to be not just a modification, but a completely separate viewpoint or system. And one example of that would be his response to the hard determinism of Democritus. He had no patience for determinism. He rejected it outright. And so it would be odd for him to attribute to Democritus his view of indeterminism when he, in fact, was rejecting Democritus's view. So, like I say, we're hanging a lot on just a little bit of information from the ancient world, but you can see the outline of a very new system beginning to take shape, very different from what his teachers held themselves. And so it's, as I keep saying, not surprising that he would claim a certain measure of originality for that.
Yeah, but on the other hand, from today's perspective, he should have at least referred to him as a source for the idea of atoms. No? So the atomism is clearly something from Democritus, and actually even before that, another guy, I forgot now the name. And then, of course, Democritus went further on this one. So it would have made sense to use Democritus as a reference for the atomism.
And of course, part of the issue is that we don't have all of Epicurus's books. Presumably, he did talk about Democritus in some of the more detailed books. We know he didn't talk specifically about Democritus in the letter to Herodotus or his ultimate summaries, but that doesn't mean that he didn't address him in the 37 books on nature. And of course, Lucretius mentions Democritus as a great man who made a mistake as to the swerve, but obviously was otherwise a great man. So Epicurus learned from Democritus and applied material from Democritus and then deviated from Democritus where he thought it was appropriate to deviate. Epicurus is not an enemy of all transmission of education and knowledge, but he's also not a friend of blindly accepting everything that comes down, and he's in favor of modification. When your observations change, you modify your conclusions.
One other point by way of inference would be we might catch a glimpse of what Epicurus might have thought of Democritus, particularly about his wide-ranging travels, by the way that Epicurus responded to Pyrrho. Even though Epicurus had no affiliation or interest in Pyrrho's skepticism, he appeared to have been very interested in Pyrrho's travels. When you went to India, what did you learn there? This sort of dovetails with what we talked about in the last bullet point, which was he was well educated and went around and consulted the different schools on what they thought. So it's very probable that simply because of Democritus's widespread travel and his desire to know everything that there was to know, that Epicurus would have had a lot of affinity for him as a person if he didn't simply accept everything that he said, which we know he did not.
The next one, Epicurus's role as a systematizer. And I think this is something that you've mentioned a number of times, Joshua. Truth of the matter is that just as with philosophers such as Herbert Spencer or Auguste Comte, that Epicurus was attempting to build sort of a synthesis and a wide range, wide spectrum of philosophical thought. He wasn't just focused on a single aspect of anything. He was really attempting to build sort of a worldview from the ground up. But there has come into being a false, superficial perspective on Epicurus that he was really sloppy and disorganized, and that he was not really a system builder who's worthy of attention. Perhaps in contrast to somebody like Aristotle, who endlessly discusses means of categorizing things and to dividing things down. Another aspect of that is something called definition within the field of logic. I think Cicero in particular accuses Epicurus of not being concerned about definition and other aspects of logical system building that were being discussed during that age. So again, in summary there, DeWitt is saying that we need to understand that Epicurus is sort of starting from scratch and then attempting to build a broad system, a broad foundation covering not only ethics, as we like to talk about, but also issues of physics, what the world is really like, and epistemology, the issue of whether knowledge is possible and how to attain knowledge that you can be confident of. So again, that's the next bullet point, that Epicurus was in fact a systematizer and that he wasn't just a horse with blinders on who wasn't even attempting to come up with a system.
Yeah, and again, I'm looking at the false opinion, and I don't know how this idea could really be brought up. I mean, it seems to me that when you look at his letters and the way that he categorized his philosophy and the canon and the principal doctrines and the 12 fundamentals of nature, there's an obvious attempt to systematize information here. So that point, I think it's just made for us, and we don't really have to push it too much harder. This interesting point about a synthesis and critique of all prior philosophical thought, that's one of the more interesting stories here. And when we read the letter to Pythocles, what we find in there is not so much just abstruse information about the sky and what happens up there, but really a methodology for how we should evaluate competing claims. And once you have a methodology for evaluating competing claims, and in developing that methodology, Epicurus is sort of prefiguring William of Ockham in his famous Razor, Principle of Economy. Once you have a method for evaluating competing claims, it only makes sense that you would want to test it against all claims that you've encountered. So you'd want to go to the Platonists and hear what they're saying and submit it to your system and see whether it stands or fails on the merits. And I think there's plenty of evidence that Epicurus was interested in doing just that. And the study of nature and the claims made about nature was a huge part of not just his life, but of every day of his life. He seemed to have spent time every day doing that.
That seems to be all the main part of his activity, as best we can tell, that he was working in a setting with his friends, working on different books on different aspects of philosophy. And so he certainly was spending most of his own time in attempting to systematize things, it seems like.
Right. And it was often the work of other Epicureans to actually write responses to these other philosophers. And so when you don't have Epicurus's tract against Plato or whatever, it'd be very easy to think that Epicurus simply had not read Plato or wasn't interested in him. But when you have Leontium writing against Theophrastus, presumably with his, assent or with his direction There's clearly an effort here to respond to all of the ideas and all of the claims that are swirling around the Aegean at this time. And I think the evidence is so clear on that point.
Okay, and speaking of swirling around the Aegean, as we go forward with this list, there are some even more controversial issues that DeWitt brings up. The next issue that he addresses is something that has probably been, in my experience, one of the most controversial issues among people who study Epicurus. Of course, probably the most controversial aspects of his philosophy in the great scheme of things is the issue of the role of pleasure, the issue of no supernatural God, the issue of no life after death. Those are the things that jump out at you as being very controversial. But among those of us who get into the study of Epicurus and who sort of come at things from a largely consistent position in the first place, there is still a major division about skepticism. And of course, the next section that DeWitt addresses is the issue of Epicurus's dogmatism. DeWitt says the true opinion is that Epicurus's strength was that he promulgated a dogmatic philosophy actuated by passion for inquiry to find certainty, and a detestation of skepticism, which he imputed even to Plato. And the false opinion that DeWitt brings up is that what we've just said is actually something to be not praised but blamed, that he promulgated a dogmatic philosophy because he renounced inquiry, as we've already discussed a little bit in terms of the Martha Nussbaum example. The idea that to be an Epicurean means to unthinkingly accept the positions of Epicurus and not to challenge them yourself, not to think through them yourself and consider them on your own, that the word dogmatic has such a negative connotation in the world today. So there's a lot to discuss there. One of the summary statements that's available in Diogenes Laertius is, I think, something to the effect that the wise man will dogmatize. So let's talk about the issue of dogmatism and what that word really means, how it should be properly interpreted, what aspects of it are more argumentative than really helpful, and how we fit Epicurus into the issue of dogmatism. What does dogmatism mean as we go further?
Yeah, in the context of Epicurus philosophy, there is this analogy, so that with mathematics or also with axiomatic physics, so that you figure out a small set of axioms, and from there you then derive more than what is obvious just from the axioms. So what Epicurus did, he figured out metaphysics, or here, because it was tried to be verifiable to some extent, we may also as well call it physics, which would then establish a materialist worldview. And from there then, from these few principles he used then to establish this one, he then can derive everything else, as has been shown by Lucretius.
I was looking for a couple of quotes to set the stage, but I'll have to paraphrase. One of them comes from Diogenes Laertius, but it's to the effect that while the other schools of philosophy would rise and fall and sort of have this broken chain of succession, the Epicureans had an unbroken line of scholarks that just seemed to go on, that they had the most enduring and robust school in the ancient world, and that this dogmatism was an issue that may have supported that. The false opinion that Epicurus's demerit was that he promulgated a dogmatic philosophy and renounced inquiry. I can see why the word dogmatism has bad connotations, and everyone will immediately think of an example of what I mean. But, I mentioned a little bit ago, Epicurus had a methodology for evaluating competing claims. The other part of that was he had a methodology for remaining aloof from certainty when you couldn't be certain about which competing claim was true. And he says that the thing that you must avoid is to be enamored of the single cause. And so people will encounter competing claims or explanations about something that they observe in nature, and will respond to that by simply becoming beholden immediately to one of them and rejecting the other. But Epicurus is saying you have to remain aloof from a conclusion until you have enough good information to actually know what you think is true about what you're observing. And that, to me, is not the kind of dogmatism that people are describing when they're hostile to this word. For example, it was decided in the last, 4 decades of the 20th century that something to the effect, does anyone know what I'm talking about here? The Catholic Church in like 1967 or something discovered that Mary must have been assumed bodily into heaven because if she didn't sin, then she was not corrupted by death or something like that. But the idea that something like this can just come down to us from the chair or from the governing body, and we just have to believe it just because the people who establish the doctrine or the dogma say we have to believe it. I don't think that's what Epicurus is assuming.
When was this example happening? Can you say that again? I missed that one.
Assumption of Mary as being a controversial issue. Is that what you're talking about? But I didn't realize it was so recent as 67 or something like that.
No. It should be 19th century because this one really caused a schism in Catholic Church in Germany and I think also elsewhere.
The question of whether Mary was taken bodily into heaven and never experienced death, is that the question?
There was something like a new dogma being declared by the Vatican, and then there were the old Catholics who rejected this Pope's decree outright and separated out.
It was Pope Pius XII, so I just got to figure out when he was the vicar of Christ on earth. He was made Pope in 1939 and died in 1958.
So it was an issue. Then it's a different issue than I was thinking of, because there was a similar thing with the dogma in 19th century, which really caused a rift. So it's a different example. So similarly, again, something was declared and by authority without that people could really understand necessarily.
You're right, Martin. That happened in 1854. I'm not sure what it was, but on the 1st of November, 1950, Pope Pius XII invoked papal infallibility for the first time since 1854 by defining the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, namely that she, having completed the course of her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. To this date, this is the last time full papal infallibility has been used. Non-Catholics may not know this, but a pope only speaks infallibly when he speaks from the chair of Peter. I can't remember the Latin word for that.
Ex cathedra, right?
Ex cathedra, yes, that's exactly right. But you see what's going on here. You have this authority figure who says that the day before that, it was not doctrine to believe this. And the fate of your eternal soul did not rest on any opinion you may have held on this point. And then the day after, suddenly this becomes an article of faith, which the faithful Catholic ought to accept. Epicurus is not, I don't think, articulating a position like the position that the Catholic Church is assuming for itself here. I guess that was my point, which we finally got to by a very circuitous route.
It may be circuitous, but I think it's really, really important because that example that we've been just talking about is why the word dogma has a bad name to it. Taking positions as absolutely true on issues that clearly you don't have enough information to take such a position on is what makes it all so disreputable to describe anybody as being dogmatic. But dogmatism in the issue has a much deeper implication because what is easy for everybody to criticize in taking a position on something so speculative as the nature of Mary's assumption to heaven takes on a different viewpoint when you start talking about, is it ever possible to be certain about anything? Because that's really the issue that Epicurus was revolting against in terms of Pyrrhonic skepticism and even Plato from his point of view. Because there are people out there, and this is directly addressed in several places. It's certainly addressed in Book 4 of Lucretius, where he talks about that those people who say that nothing can be known are essentially standing on their heads, and you can't even reason with these people because their own logic, their own argument makes no sense. When they say nothing can be known, they are taking a position that nothing can be known as if that statement, nothing can be known, is itself certain. They're talking in riddles and in circles to take such a position. But radical skepticism, as advanced by Pyrrho and others, does ultimately end up in a very similar position as that when they say that nothing can be known. And so, as often it seems Epicurus is doing, he's not necessarily coming down in the middle between two extremes, but he's looking at the two extreme positions and rejecting both of them in favor of a position that he thinks is correct. He's rejecting the idea that nothing can be known. He's also rejecting the idea that there's a supernatural God who can deliver to you some kind of absolute truth on everything. He's rejecting both of those positions and looking for a fair, reasonable position that is supported by the evidence on when to take a position about being confident of something and when not to take a position on being confident of something. Joshua's already referred to this, but Velleius speaks in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. I have the C.D. Young translation in front of me. I've always thought it was funny, and so it's probably worth quoting exactly the Young version of it. At the beginning of the section where the Epicurean speaker Velleius starts, Cicero writes, "Hereupon Velleius began, in the confident manner, I need not say, that is customary with Epicureans, afraid of nothing so much as lest he should appear to have doubts about anything. One would have supposed he had just come down from the assembly of the gods in the intermundane spaces of Epicurus." And so I think that's actually fairly witty. And if true, it would be cutting, but that's an overstatement of the issue. Epicurus doesn't take a dogmatic position about everything in life, everything in the universe. He specifically lays out the guidelines for when you can be sure about something and when you cannot be sure about something. That's when you get to the issue of the multiple causes, again, that Joshua has already suggested. If multiple causes can equally explain a phenomena, then to take one of them and say that that's the only cause that's correct is absolutely arbitrary and makes no sense from a logical perspective. So it's not a matter of Epicurus being dogmatic like the Pope and saying that everything is absolutely the way that God says it is and that you must accept my viewpoint. That's not Epicurus's position at all. But it's also not Epicurus's position to say that nothing can be known and that we can never reach a conclusion about anything, which I don't know whether you could say that one of those is worse than the other. But at least in the modern world, we have problems from both ends still like they did then. We have people who will take the position that religion can answer every question for you with certainty. And we have people who'll take the position that nothing can ever be known. So the best you can do is just hunker down, keep your head low and go live in your cave and try to stay out of the line of fire. But Epicurus is not taking either of those positions, I would say.
Just as an aside, what Martin was describing happened in 1854, and that was the promulgation by Pope Pius IX on the Immaculate Conception of Mary. So in two instances within the last 200 years, we have a 2,000-year-old church that changed its mind on two articles of faith. So again, everything you've been saying, Cassius, this is not the dogmatism of Epicurus. This is not the way it operates. And so that's that, I guess, on that point.
One more thing there I'll say is that whole orientation reminds me of what Martin was saying earlier about how much time do you really need to spend on incorrect opinions and talking about what people in the past have said. If you really are truly a dogmatic person, you're going to have to spend basically all your time on reading history and what people have said in the past because you're slavishly following what people have said in the past as the basis for your own opinions. And that's not what Epicurus talks about at all. He really is not telling you to go read all these books about other philosophers and then follow X, Y, and Z lines of argument. He's telling you an opposite approach, which is to trust your own senses, trust your own observations, and use that as your ultimate standard for what you're going to conclude with confidence to be right and wrong, not just using some dead philosopher's argument that you will never even have access to the full details of. It's more important for you to understand that your senses are trustworthy, that they are what you have to deal with from nature as the basis for making decisions, than it is to spend all your time reading history about what other philosophers have said. Those historical arguments, it's the arguments themselves sometimes that are worth repeating because to the extent that they're useful, they bring up topics that you need to think about. But as far as who said them and when and in what context and so forth, all of those details start to fade into the background when you approach life the way Epicurus is suggesting. Okay, the next item is similar. It is Epicurus's view of truth. And what DeWitt says is that Epicurus exalted nature as the norm of truth, revolting against Plato, who had preached reason as the norm and considered reason to have a divine existence of its own. Epicurus studied and taught the nature and use of sensations and their role in determining that which we consider to be true. And the false opinion, I don't know if we'll even finish this topic today, but the false opinion there, in contrast to that, is that Epicurus was a modern empiricist and that he declared that sensation is the only source of knowledge, or even that all sensations are, quote, true, unquote, which is a very deep subject. But let's talk about Epicurus's view of truth for just a moment. And is there a norm? Is there a standard against which you can even ever arrive at truth about anything? What is truth? Quoting Pontius Pilate, what is truth?
So once again, I'm looking here at the false opinion. Epicurus was an empiricist in the modern sense, declaring sensation to be the only source of knowledge and all sensations to be true. You made the point yourself, Cassius, this is a very deep and difficult issue. And I would say that even Francis Wright maybe presented a version of Epicurus that was more steeped in an empiricist view than maybe he really was in antiquity, because Epicurus thought that sensation was one leg of the tripod of epistemology, or one way that we know what is true. But there are two other ways, and you can't call yourself an empiricist if you hold to those two other ways.
The anticipations and the feelings.
Yes. And the feelings, of course, are so paramount in the discussion that they form a huge part of his ethical conclusions. But okay, so this is an early expression of a formulation that DeWitt uses repeatedly throughout this book, which is that nature furnishes the norm, revolting against Plato, who had preached reason as the norm, that reason has some independent existence that we can respond to, or that there is a logos or a divine fire that furnishes the norm. And I have to get in my caveat here, which is that when we say that nature furnishes the norm, this is different from the modern position, which is also a Catholic position, of natural law, that we can make inferences about very, very specific ethical decisions and transgressions based on what is in nature. And I reject that position entirely, and I think that Epicurus would have rejected that position entirely. What nature gives us is a toolkit for assessing and evaluating competing claims about everything from ethics to explanations for phenomena. And so which tool you're going to use for the job is going to depend on what exactly it is that you're trying to establish. But in all cases, he does want to bring the discussion back to the foundation, back to the source, which is nature, not so that he can say that, oh, that's unnatural and you've violated the commandment of God and the creator of nature, and that nature is a revelation of the creator and therefore we know his will from nature. That's not Epicurus's position at all. Simply that nature furnishes the norm because we are natural. We derive from nature. We're part of nature. And so that something like pleasure and pain as guides to how we should live our lives makes sense for us because that's the norm that nature gives us to make those kinds of decisions. It wouldn't make sense to say that my Volkswagen Jetta should use pleasure and pain to decide what to do, because it wasn't given by nature the ability to do any of those things. So very muddled as I'm going through this, but yeah, somebody else jump in.
Yeah, there's actually two bullet points here in DeWitt's outline that are very closely related. The one we're on now is Epicurus's view of truth. The next one that we'll come to in just a moment is Epicurus's method for determining truth. And I do think it's useful to keep these separate for a few more minutes before we get into the method for determining truth, because as we get into the method, we'll start talking about types of logic and how to pursue logic and so forth. But the preliminary question before you get to types of logic is the deeper question of, is logic itself a norm to be used as an ultimate ruler or standard to compare against? It's my understanding that canonics, as the term that Epicurus was using for his epistemology, canonics is supposed to refer to a standard or a ruler or something that is to be compared against. The canon in Catholic theology, what does that mean in Catholicism?
Yeah, the meaning there is different. There is a set of essentially statements which constitute the teachings. And so this is different from the entirely different application of the word canon.
Yeah, the use of the word canon here is extremely important to drill down in, and maybe it has different meanings in different contexts as well. So for somebody who was brought up in Protestantism like myself, I'm understanding that when the Catholics talk about their canon, they're talking about, well, what is ultimately their truth? In other words, Protestants think of the canon as being the Bible, but Catholics, being more realistic about the origin of the Bible, know that they basically wrote the Bible themselves, and therefore there's more to be taken. There's church doctrine and church teaching and so forth that's come down since the Bible was written as their ultimate canon.
The thing is, the definition of canon, as it's used by the Catholic Church, it's a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine. And what we refer in Epicurean philosophy is rather the other definition of the word canon, which is something different. It's a general law, rule, principle, or criterion by which something is judged. In these two contexts, the word canon has an entirely different meaning. So that means we need to be sure which meaning we use. And in Epicurean philosophy, we use this as this general law.
Even within the Catholic Church, there are different ways of using the word canon. You can talk about canon law, which is how the church itself operates, sort of like any organization would have its own laws on how it operates. There's another word, though, which would be the catechism of the Catholic Church. This would really be a thorough breakdown of its doctrines or dogmas. And I guess there's not a clear mapping of how Epicurus uses the word canon to how Catholicism uses the word canon.
Like I said, this word has two completely different meanings, and Catholic Church uses it in one way and Epicurean philosophy in the other, and it's very clear. I see there no ambiguity in the word, in the way each side uses it.
Now, what DeWitt is saying here in this first bullet point is he's talking about the norm of truth. And we could probably substitute words like standard of truth and so forth. But I always sort of in my own mind come back to thinking that what's going on here is that in all of our searching for all of the answers to all the questions that we're asking, we're ultimately going to have to make a decision on where are we going to end up as ultimate authority. That Epicurus is ultimately saying that nature is the proper place to look for that authority for right and wrong and for all these other answers that you need. And DeWitt is alleging that Plato had taken the different position that logos or reason in itself is superior to nature as this norm of truth. And I always tend to think of things in terms of three big alternatives being either nature or reason or logos, or if you're really into religion, you'd say the word of God or divinity or divine revelation as another source of truth. But I think that that's kind of where we're going in this first category here is identifying ultimately in the end, what are you going to accept as your ultimate authority? Is it nature or is it something else? What about that?
What this has to do with is how you view basic metaphysical claims about what nature is. Does nature have any existence independent from the human mind? Does it have any existence independent from abstract principles like reason or divine fire? Is nature merely an ephemeral mirage that actually conceals the truth rather than revealing it to us, as Plato seems to have believed? Is nature merely creation and therefore simply one aspect of revelation from God, but does not answer the total purpose of revelation? So these are all the different competing ideas you can have about the role of nature in the spirit of inquiry and whether we can learn anything from nature or not. Because it seems to be the outright position of people of, I guess, idealist schools of philosophy that nature lies to us constantly, and that if you're going to get the truth, you have to, in a way of putting it, penetrate the veil. You have to see through nature into what lies on the other side of nature, whether that's God or ideal forms or divine fire or any of the other competing ideas.
I know in the world of law, there's a court I'm familiar with which has a slogan in Latin, and the two-word slogan is nihil ultra, which I understand the Latin to mean nothing higher. And so the question becomes, what is it above which there is nothing higher as your standard of truth? We talk about pleasure in terms of the highest goal or guide of life. But in terms of truth, is there anything higher than nature itself as a standard of truth? And whether Plato ultimately did or did not do this, it is apparently held by a lot of people that Plato was suggesting that the logos, or what is it in the book of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, the logos and so forth is actually higher than nature itself, that the logos created nature. basically, that God created nature. You can't look just to nature for your norm of truth because God is behind nature. God is superior to nature.
Yeah, Plato says in quite stark terms that the telos is agreed by all wise men to be that which everything else is judged against, but that the telos itself is judged against nothing because it is the standard.
We generally talk about that in terms of ethics and rules of action and so forth. But in this context we're talking about right now as the ultimate standard of truth, it's sort of the same question. What is ultimately your final authority for determining something to be right or wrong? Is it some standard that logic has revealed to you? Is it some standard that religion reveals to you? Or is it some standard that nature gives to you? And that's where you go back into where Epicurus says that nature gives us no guidance for what to choose and avoid other than pleasure and pain. I would say that's probably the root of that conclusion is if you accept that nature is the ultimate standard of authority, then you take the faculties that nature has given you as the starting point for making all decisions on what to choose and what to avoid. Okay, we're probably going a little long. We'll continue this part of the discussion, especially since it's so deep. We'll save the next bullet point of method for determining truth until next week, because if we keep going on this, we'll almost definitely run longer than we should. So let's start talking about closing thoughts for today. Martin?
No, I don't really have a closing thought, but I found the word I forgot. So it's polemic. So that means Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies was characterized by himself as a polemic. So that means we should not treat it as you would say, for example, would treat a common text from philosophy analyzing some older text or something like this. So this one, the polemic is something like what philosophers use to spice up their interaction with each other by really strongly attacking each other in words which may be sometimes a bit really over the top or coming to the point and ignore subtleties.
Is that polemic versus didactic? Is that the contrast? Is didactic teaching versus polemic meaning argument?
I would say that the opposite of polemic, I don't know about opposite, but a contrasting approach would be apologetics. But yeah, in the case of Karl Popper in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, it's clear just from the title that this is not a dispassionate account of things. He's clearly supporting the open society, and he's clearly writing in opposition to the enemies of the open society. And, if you read Diogenes Laertius in his biography of Epicurus, he gives lists of books that were written by Epicureans in the ancient world. How many of those books start out with the word against? Mm-hmm. Against Plato, against Aristotle, against Theophrastus, against Pyrrho, so Epicurus and the Epicurean school and the other people who wrote and taught and thought in that same area in the same time took a very similar approach because some ideas are important enough that you have to make a case for them.
Right. I've seen DeWitt make that argument in regard to Cicero. There being two different approaches. One approach being you're setting out in your work to find the truth is one option. But then option number two is you're setting out in your work to prove the other person is wrong. And to a large degree, that's what DeWitt thinks Cicero was doing in his own Ends book and his other books, is not that Cicero was dispassionately trying to find the truth of the matter, but that Cicero was setting out to prove that the people he disagreed with were wrong and setting out to allege that the people he agreed with were correct, which is a different type of approach. Similar to, again, in the court of law, you're not necessarily finding the truth as a lawyer. You're attempting to argue your client's position.
Yeah, there's a really interesting text from the Renaissance by Lorenzo Valla, who was actually apostolic secretary to a pope after Poggio Bracciolini, who discovered the Lucretius manuscript in a monastery in Fulda. Lorenzo Valla wrote a dialogue in which he has a character put forth, actually, and defend Epicurus' system of philosophy. And then he has a Christian come in at the end and sort of knock it all down. And it's legitimately not clear from the book whether Lorenzo Valla agreed with the Epicurean position or with the Christian position. It's possible that he used this as a Trojan horse to get Epicurus' views into print. Certainly that was Poggio's view. Poggio accused him of being an Epicurean.
We'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes because we've discussed that on the forum before. I can't remember the title of the work, but I remember that I've read that work by Lorenzo Valla that you're talking about. And it really is a good example of, even though he is not overtly arguing the Epicurean position, and in fact is overtly arguing against it, I think, superficially, but the strength that's so clear in the argument shines through that the Epicurean position is, even though it's being described as the worst one, is actually the better one. Joshua?
I just hope that we've done a good enough job of explaining this issue of dogma. As you said in the opening, Cassius, this was one of the more controversial aspects of Epicurean philosophy. And it's exactly the kind of people who would be most interested in Epicurean philosophy, who are going to be most turned off or put off by the use of that word. Hopefully we've done a good enough job of explaining it. And of course, one thing that's going to happen as we go through this whole series on Norman DeWitt is that we're still in chapter 1. He's still taking what we described in the first episode, which is the synoptic view. This is just a very cursory overview of everything that's about to come in the rest of this book. So tune in next week.
You've said several things there I have to comment on. I think this is why DeWitt, again, I'll repeat, this is such a good book. DeWitt starts out this book by telling you to remember that Epicurus is one of the most revered and the most reviled philosophers in the history of the world. And so when people say that Epicurus is dogmatic, they're attempting to turn you off to the idea that Epicurus is important to listen to. Because the truth is, Epicurus was taking a question authority approach his entire life. He never expected people to just listen to what he said and blindly or dogmatically accept it as true without validation, without reasoning that supported it. And if you don't accept the reasoning, if you don't accept the evidence, then you're not going to accept the conclusion. But there's never anything in Epicurean philosophy that says you're going to be burned at the stake, you're going to be banned from society, you're going to be thrown into prison for not believing a position that Epicurus taught. He's the opposite of what we today worry about when we talk about dogmatic positions. So he's anti-dogmatic from the way we would look at it today. It's just that when you drill down and get to the meat of the matter and understand what he's talking about, you have to understand that the issue of knowledge is very important. And those people who take the position that knowledge is possible, they are classically described correctly as dogmatists because they do believe that some dogma, some truth is possible to obtain. The key issue is how far that truth goes and in what areas and what evidence you have to support it and things like that.
In order to avoid the word dogmatic, we can rather use the word axiomatic. I don't think axiomatic has as bad connotations as dogmatic.
No, I don't think it does either. That's a good point, Martin, for just generally what we're continuing to do in these preliminary episodes of this section of our podcast is we're attempting to acclimate people to the general issues that Epicurus was discussing and make sure that they're not trapped or diverted by incorrect opinions about Epicurus, which unfortunately have tended to multiply over the last 2,000 years, and to the point where the word Epicurean is considered to refer to nothing but good food and pleasure of the moment, which is the furthest thing from the truth about what Epicurus was really concerned about. There's just layers and layers of misunderstanding and actual misrepresentation and distortion that have to be rolled away before you can really understand what Epicurus is all about. So that's probably a good place for us to stop for today. We'll come back next week. So thank you very much, and we'll see you then.